This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include Syndicated columnist and author John Hood. We welcome you back after a week. Former state senator, former chair of the State Board of Education, Howard Lee. Political consultant and also communications consultant, Brad Crone. And Becki Gray from the John Locke Foundation. Well, we've got a really good one for you this week, starting with a discussion about Hurricane Harvey and Irma and Jose, the merger of two large hospital networks in our state, and the reaction to President Trump's action on children brought to this country and specifically to our state. Plus, as always, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Let's get started. This is storm season, especially along our coastal areas. We've seen the pictures of the devastation that Hurricane Harvey wreaked to the Gulf, but now our focus is turned this past week to Hurricane Irma, Jose, and the threats they might pose to our region of the country. Becki, you were recently in Texas for a week and reported that after Hurricane Harvey, the many examples of people coming to the aid of those affected by this storm. And we've seen it in our own area as well. But I wonder why it takes a natural disaster for us to be able to put aside our political and philosophical differences and show our better angels to each other.
You know why, Tom? Because there are more angels than there are protesters. And I think it's important to remember that these protesters that we've seen, the ugliness that we've seen, the intolerance that we've seen, it's a very small number of people. What we've seen with the Good Samaritans, with the angels, as you refer to, that's what America's really about. That's who we are. That's who we are as a people. And so I think that although we have certainly seen example after example after example of this humanitarian effort, completely dismissing, all differences that we have. That's who we really are. We've just seen it more. It's been on the front page of the newspaper, but that's really who we are as Americans.
And sometimes it takes that to put aside some of these others. Brad, we've seen all this damage, and we certainly feel for the people affected by Harvey, as those who've already been affected by Irma and perhaps stand to be in days to come. But there's still thousands of people in our state who were affected by Hurricane Matthews and Hurricane Irene. And despite the pleadings of Governors Cooper and McCrory, we haven't seen the large amounts of government aid that's already been pledged to some of these areas. Is it because they're mostly rural, poor areas, or what's the reason?
I think not necessarily rural or poor. I think it's an internal fight between FEMA and state emergency management officials, the allocation of resources and how they were going to be applied and how the plan was being managed. So I think you've had more bureaucrats fighting and not necessarily listening to the concerns that your executive officers, Governor McCrory and Governor Cooper, have voiced.
So why haven't they gotten this aid? I hear the bureaucratic part of it, but the president has already said he wants billions of dollars down in the Houston area, and we've been struggling here and haven't gotten a whole lot of aid, John.
Well, we have. It hasn't been reported in the same fashion. Some of the aid was already spent. This is a little bit of an exaggeration, but the other thing I would say is that when you have a hurricane hit a big city like a Katrina in New Orleans, or in this case, Houston, you transfix the nation in a way. There's a whole lot of people in one place affected by the storm in a way that is different from affecting a significant number of people over a wide swath of less populated areas.
Yeah, but Howard, isn't human need and suffering the same regardless of whether it's in a Houston or whether it's in a Red Springs, North Carolina?
Well, I think even in Red Springs, the suffering is probably even greater, because there are so few resources to go around there, and they have to rely completely and totally on outside entities like state government and federal government. So I think that need is probably more dire than in some of the cities where there are a few more resources to rely on.
And Becki, one of the things that just astounded me with Hurricane Harvey, I don't know how much of it you saw when you were down in Texas, was that they were issued mandatory evacuation areas and didn't leave. Why not?
I bet they're asking themselves that very question. And some of those
Well, what does it
mandatory
take to get people
evacuations,
to pay attention and do it?
probably a storm like Harvey and these other storms that we're having that may or may not hit the East Coast. I mean, I think people are taking these things seriously. I want to mention back to Brad's point about why we aren't getting this aid. And I think that the bureaucratic red tape and all that we've seen with some of the Hurricane Matthew recovery that we have not gotten here in North Carolina is because it gets caught up in all of this. And I think if there's a core function of government and a time for government to open up get all of the burdens out of the way
together.
in order to do that, that's what we need to do.
I ran into Pat McCrory 3 weeks ago, and Governor McCrory was talking about that there was an ongoing dispute between the federal government and how much money was allocated into a state fund on housing to provide immediate housing for those who have been displaced, and then a concern over the state legislative contributions. So, I mean, that's the type of wrangling that you have going on between FEMA
Well, the
and your state
legislature
emergency
stepped up to the
management.
plate now.
The legislature's done their
that.
part.
Yeah,
they
I
have.
think they did.
Kudos to the General Assembly for putting that money in the
No
rainy day
question.
fund and for these natural disasters.
No question about it. I think they've done a good job with that. John, one of the things that impressed me as I was watching a lot of this coverage unfold was the number of new housing and business developments, large homes that have been built along the coast, in floodplain areas even. Are these people kind of like riverboat gamblers from the standpoint of the fact that they know what the risks are and they're willing to take them? They don't know what the risks are, or they just pray against hope that they're not going to be hit?
Well, you're leaving out an option, which is that they're riverboat gamblers where if they win, they get to enjoy their wonderful houses, and if they lose, we pay the bill. Part of the problem here is having a subsidized flood insurance program. In the first place, I know this makes me very popular among people who have second homes and live on the coast, but we should not be subsidizing people to live in floodplains, particularly when we're not talking about primary residences, but second homes and so forth. This is a system that if the people had to bear the cost of their own risk that they were taking, they would take fewer risks, and that's ultimately what we want.
And you talk about this national flood insurance program. I've got a house in coastal North Carolina, and I got to tell you, it ain't worth a poop. I mean, you struggle to try to get them to pay you money. It takes them forever to do it.
Well, they're out of money with it.
They're out of money. They're bankrupt right now.
I mean, this was during Hurricane Irene, and I got about a third of what I spent to try to rehab my house. Howard, when we get to it, whose responsibility? John talked about the government's response. Whose responsibility is it to try to make these homes, these people, whole as much as possible? Is it the governments? Is it the communities? Is it individuals? Is it philanthropic organizations?
Yeah,
Or all of the above?
We can't always continue to rely on government to do everything. And that's one of the concerns that I have, is that there was a time when communities would step up and do for themselves. They'd find ways to find resources, and they'd work together to support each other and try to resolve many of these problems. I don't see that as much anymore, particularly among churches that used to be one of the key entities for doing that. But government still has the primary responsibility for ensuring that the resources are there.
Should they?
Well, to a certain extent, yes, you've got to provide for the general welfare. I think from a broader argument, Tom, though, I mean, we're having more 1,000-year storms every 2 and 3 years now. So I think you've got to look at a broader argument, too, of, engaging in an environmental scientific debate about climate change.
Becki?
I don't disagree with Brad that that's probably an important discussion to have, but also those decisions, it's not like we can make that decision today and in 2 weeks or in 2 years we can have it all fixed. I mean, these are long-term, they're very expensive projects to put into place, and there's a lot of moving parts to it. It's something that can't be done overnight, it can't be done quickly. It has to be done with a great deal of thought, a great deal of research of how to do it right. And I think getting, to your question too, or your point, Howard, about, whose responsibility is whose? I mean, what do we expect of government? What do we expect of communities? What do we expect of each other?
Well,
and,
but let's be very clear, though, about the fact that we do have rising bills for dealing with storms, higher than ever before kind of thing. That is not because storms are on average more frequent or more intense, or at least that's not the main issue. The main issue is there is more property that is on rivers, on beaches that are destroyed.
And the cost of repairing them has escalated.
And it has to do with that.
Bigger
It's not a weather
houses.
issue primarily, it's a development issue.
And I'm going to take part of the responsibility back to local governments. Local governments have abdicated their responsibility to zone and plan in a way that they don't approve projects in flood areas. You go to Chapel Hill on a place called Estes Drive, where they put a big apartment project right in an absolute wet area, and then they get surprised every year when a big rain comes and it floods.
Well, we pray here that you keep informed on the progress of these storms, follow the instructions that are issued, and regardless of the path, we pray that all will avoid risk and be safe. And to get more take on this, be sure to read my column in this week's NC Spin. In recent weeks, many have signed up to receive our free weekly email newsletter Spin Cycle. If you're not getting it, you should. Easy to do just by going to our website, ncspin.com. And while you're there, you can check for the video footage not seen on the air, see recent editions of NC Spin shows, perspective pieces from our panelists and others, and again, read my column. So get more balanced debate for the Old North State at ncspin.com or NCSpin on Facebook or on Twitter at NCSpin Tweets. When we come back, mega mergers in healthcare.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
In 2011, our farmers asked for 6,500 seasonal workers. Only 7 Americans showed up to work those jobs. Immigrant farm workers aren't stealing American jobs. To say otherwise ignores the facts. When farmers don't have enough skilled workers, crops go unharvested and farmers lose money. Consumers face fewer choices and higher prices. This is not acceptable. Tell Congress it's time to fix our broken immigration system.
With today's tools, all the information you need is just a click away.
I'm going to show you how to remove the...
And as a member of an electric cooperative, you have access to lots of valuable tools. Tools that help you do it yourself when it comes to controlling your home energy use and budget, leaving you free to be Dad. Discover how your electric cooperative can help you control your energy use at EmpowerMeNC.com.
We now return to NC Spin.
Just prior to the Labor Day holiday, 2 of North Carolina's largest hospital networks, Carolina's healthcare system based in Charlotte and the UNC healthcare system based in Chapel Hill, announced they wanted to merge and create one of the leading healthcare systems in the nation. Brad Crone, you've been actively involved in healthcare on both the state and national level for many years. What's your perspective as to the benefits and the downside?
Shockwave, tidal wave across the healthcare industry, not only here in North Carolina, but all across the nation. And it's a testament to the concerns that you're seeing in our healthcare delivery system, the upheaval. Tom, over the last 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, the healthcare delivery system has changed their business model to comply with the Affordable Care Act. Right, wrong, or indifferent. It's been the law of the land since 2010. So they have made critical investments to build out a business model that follows the ACA, that looks at new payment models, that accommodates accountable care organizations. I think you're going to see more consolidations. And so this means your big systems in the state, such as Wake Med, such as Novant, such as Forsyth, Cone, Moses Cone in Greensboro,
Vidant
down in Greenville and Fayetteville and New Hanover are going to be forced to merge.
But Howard, we've seen this in the corporate world where banks would small banks would merge together and become mega banks and mega industries and so forth like that. And the mantra has always been bigger is better. Do you think that's the case with healthcare?
I think not. I'm really concerned that the bigger these organizations become, the less significant is the human part of treatment and caring for patients. We all go to these hospitals and these clinics, and we're just kind of a number sitting in a waiting room hoping sometime during the day we'll get seen. I just think they're becoming too big, too focused on business, and too engaged in trying to make profit. And they're like Pac-Man. They're running around just
even though they're
everything.
Nonprofit organizations, they're making profit.
Absolutely.
Becki, one of the things that Brad mentioned that I think is worth exploring a little bit is over the last decade or so here in North Carolina especially, we've seen these hospitals, UNC Healthcare, CHS, Vidant, all these hospital networks that have been gobbling up little smaller hospitals. Can you say for any kind of certainty that you think we're getting better health care as a result of them?
I can't, no. And, you know, it concerns me about the quality of health care. It concerns me about the cost of health care. And it also concerns me about the access to health care. You mentioned in the rural areas, these small hospitals, when these big hospitals consolidate and bring all this together, what we're seeing is a lot of these facilities in the rural areas are closing. They can no longer function. They can't compete with these big monopolies. And so what you have is you have less and less health care available to people in rural parts of the state.
Well, John, we understand some of these smaller rural hospitals are really struggling right now. As a matter of fact, I understand that there are between 3 and 5 rural hospitals in smaller communities in North Carolina that are struggling to keep their doors open. Is this going to help them?
Well, it might. I mean, we need a little more precision.
How so?
We need more precision about this issue. Number one, I don't believe this is a merger, at least not formally a merger. I think it is a proposal to work together, but they are not formally going to merge into one entity as far as I know. That's not the way it's been described.
They said it was going to be one world-class network.
They're going to have an overarching board and everything, but the two entities are not going to be formally one entity as far as I know. But the reason I bring that up is lots of these systems we're talking about, sometimes they have acquired hospitals, but lots of times they are running hospitals. They don't actually own them. Some of these are alliances rather than formal merger organizations. And part of the reason why some of the rural hospitals end up getting purchased by or run by is because they otherwise would go out of business and the chains essentially come in and save them some money. Now, I'm not advocating this particular alliance or / merger makes me uncomfortable, but I'm just saying the market was already changing. As Brad said, once you pass the Affordable Care Act, whether you know it or not, you are creating these gigantic entities. That was part of the obvious outcome of the bill. This is just
if somehow it got repealed, Brad, would some of this be unwound?
No, it won't be unwound, and you're going to continue to see more consolidation in the healthcare sector because they need the volume of business to be able to compete and to continue their operations.
And they're gobbling up these doctor groups and
absolutely, and you're going to see more consolidation in the healthcare, whether Trump Care is enacted or we continue with the Affordable Care Act.
Just to circle back to the access, you know, when you have these big hospitals that doctors no longer can have an individual, or it's much more difficult to have an individual practice, you have to question who is going to be attracted to this. Are we going to be able to get physicians? What is this going to look like in 10 years or 15 years?
Why did the hospitals buy up the doctor practices? So they could get more money out of the government. I mean, there's nothing particularly mysterious about this. You bill at a higher rate when you work for a hospital. Okay, so some of this is the inevitable consequence of the policies that we're
enacting. Final comment, Howard.
Government ought to step up and say to these organizations, if you're going to go down this road, by golly, you're going to have an obligation of serving underserved areas, and you've got to come up with a plan.
Well, now, in fairness, they say they're going to do that, and I will accept that. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about Dreamers No More.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
The North Carolina General Assembly recently gave state retirees a well-deserved cost of living increase. Now local governments across North Carolina need to follow the legislature's lead and include retiree cost of living increases in their budgets. These increases are long overdue and desperately needed by all our retirees. The legislature heard us, and they did what's right. It's time for local governments to do the same. Learn more at ncrgea.com.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
This past Tuesday, President Trump announced he was going to do away with the 2012 executive order that protected children brought to this country, known as Dreamers. We're told that there's some 27,000 of them here in our state. Howard Lee, we know Senator Tom Tillis, among others, had urged the president not to take this action. What's your reaction to what he did?
I'm sorry the president went down this road on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think it might be a blessing in disguise. Congress has not done its job when it comes to immigration, and by setting this window of deadline, maybe this will force them to get up and do something and try to rectify this problem.
Well, in essence, that's what he said. I mean, It was almost like he was calling their bluff to a certain extent, wasn't it? So is there a better way that he could have handled this situation, Brad?
I believe President Obama did a good job on handling this. President Trump has kicked a hornet's nest, and I also think that shows a real spirit of meanness coming out of the Republican Party and the White House when it comes to these people who are here under conditions that they chose not themselves.
So, Becki, do you believe we've got 27,000 of them here in North Carolina? Let's look at that for a minute. Many of them have been here since they were small children. They are now, in many instances, grown. They've gone to our schools. They've graduated. They've got jobs. If their documentation is not renewed, what's going to happen to them?
Well, let me just add to that, too. Some figures from the Cato Institute this week have said that it's about a $10 billion impact on our state budget and our economy. So, I mean, it's a big deal.
In North Carolina?
In North Carolina alone. It is a big deal. But I think that Howard really has brought up the most important part of this is that what President Obama did by executive order was taking that responsibility away from Congress. It is Congress's responsibility to set immigration policy.
Wasn't that because Congress wouldn't do it?
Well,
I mean, every president since Bill Clinton.
But I think that's what President Trump is doing. He's going back and saying this is not the job of the president. This is the job of the Congress. And this is not an easy answer. What the Congress ought to do is they ought to take this up and they ought to do exactly what Brad's suggesting. They ought to take it up and they ought to pass it. They ought not add other things to it.
Attorney General Sessions said that DACA was unconstitutional, and I don't know whether it is or whether it isn't. But I thought it was fairly interesting after the uproar that all of this caused, President Trump came back and said he might be willing to reconsider his position. That in turn set off a reaction from people on the far right who said, this is one of your campaign promises, you better stick with it. What's your take as to what's going to happen here?
Well, I think the Congress will do something about it, as they should. This is fundamentally a question of the rule of law. If the president's disappointed, as Obama was, with the Congress not acting, that doesn't mean he gets to do whatever he wants. He doesn't have the authority to change the law. I'm in favor of changing the law, but the rule of law matters, and just saying, well, President Obama did what the Congress wouldn't do, that's not how a Republican form of government works. You don't get just to do whatever you want because the other branch of government doesn't do what you think.
But you got to look at the human side too, John. You had 800,000 people across the nation who are in limbo because Congress wouldn't do their job. So if Congress Congress doesn't do the job, doesn't the President of the United States shoulder some of that responsibility, take the leadership, and deal with the problem?
He is not a dictator. He doesn't have any power.
Right, but they could have fixed it if they'd have passed an immigration law.
Of course.
The chickens have to come home. The rules on Congress.
Well, if this is a $10 billion proposition in North Carolina, wow.
Well, that may be immigration as a whole. I don't know that it's the Dreamers in particular.
The Cato information that came out this week, that was the
About
report
the
that I
Dreamers?
read.
Okay.
Yeah, that it was just here in North Carolina. I think it's $200 billion in the nation as a whole.
Wow.
But it's a big impact.
big
It makes
number.
a difference. And you know, Brad, I agree with you. Congress ought to do something. They ought to fix this.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
The healthcare landscape is filled with questions and uncertainties of changes that are coming. In these times of change, there's one thing you can trust. You can trust your family physician to work for you, not only in treating sickness and disease, but also your overall health. Regardless of how healthcare might change, the men and women of the North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians pledge to work upholding your trust. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisors.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
We now return to NC Spin.
Now we come to the part of the program so many of you tell us that you like, and that is when we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Becki Gray, we'll start with you.
Cities matter. Tom, we talk a lot about regulation, we talk about taxes, we talk about overreach of government at the federal level, at the state level. There's also a lot of that happens at the city level, whether it's property taxes, those kind of things, how that money's spent. We've got a lot of cities that are building coliseums and ballparks and all kinds of foolishness that they ought not be doing. Also regulations on people's lives, whether it's land use, other things. Cities are someplace to really pay attention to.
Particularly this fall, we've got city elections.
We've got a lot of
coming.
municipal elections.
Brad
yes.
Crone, tell us something we don't know.
Tom, it looks like the legislative effort to allow unaffiliated politicians, candidates, to get on the ballot by meeting a certain threshold to reduce that threshold has stalled out in the legislature right now. We'll probably go into next year's election with the standards we have right now, which in a congressional district in North Carolina, if you're independent and you want to run for office, you got to get 19,000 signatures.
So ballot access is going to continue to be a problem.
Yes.
Howard Lee, tell us something we don't know.
You know, I've been watching very closely what the future of the historical black colleges and universities in our state will be. I'm pleased to see that there is a possible uptick on the enrollment in those schools.
Oh, that is good news. John Hood, tell us something we don't know.
3 congressmen, interestingly, Walter Jones, David Price, both Republican and Democrat, and Mark Meadows, the head of the House Freedom Caucus, have come out strongly against partisan gerrymandering. I found that fascinating.
Wow. Welcome to the party. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback and read my weekly column. Be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And join us next week when we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.